There's a country that keeps showing up in your feed. Soldiers in short shorts, FAL rifles, camo patterns that you've never seen anywhere else, and songs from a war that ended before most of you were born. They're obsessed with a place called Rhodesia, a country that hasn't existed since 1980. And if you ask them why, they'll tell you stories about the last stand of Western civilization in Africa, about brilliant military tactics, and about a people who refused to surrender. You might remember the 2006 film Blood Diamond. Leonardo DiCaprio plays a Rhodesian smuggler navigating the civil war chaos in Sierra Leone. That line, "I'm from Rhodesia," was supposed to tell you everything. A white African, a man from a place that no longer exists. The person in that conversation directly responds, "Don't you mean Zimbabwe?" The film showed how diamonds funded brutality, how resources and power intersect in African conflicts, but it never explained what Rhodesia actually was or why it disappeared. Here's what nobody actually tells you. What Rhodesia really was, how it actually worked, and why it collapsed in just 15 years. Because the real story of Rhodesia isn't about heroism or tactics or holding the line. It's about 270,000 people trying to rule over 5 million at gunpoint. It's about an economy built on stolen land that was running out of time. It's about what happens when you fight a war you mathematically cannot win. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Rhodesia failed. Not the mythology, not the aesthetics, the actual mechanics of collapse. Let me just show you what we're dealing with in under 6 minutes. In 1965, a guy named Ian Smith declared independence from Britain. Not because Britain was oppressing Rhodesia, but because Britain wanted Rhodesia to let black people vote. Smith said no. And on November 11th, 1965, he read a declaration on TV that deliberately copied the American Declaration of Independence, except for one crucial difference. The Americans in 1776 represented the majority fighting for self-rule. Smith in 1965 represented 5% of the population fighting to deny self-rule to the other 95%. The math was this: 270,000 whites, 5 million blacks. In a democracy, whites would have virtually zero political power. So they simply refused to have a democracy. Britain said this was illegal and slapped on sanctions. The UN condemned it. Every country on Earth refused to recognize Rhodesia as a legitimate state, and white Rhodesians celebrated in the streets because they thought they had won. What it actually had done was start a timer, because two liberation movements, ZAPU and ZANU, immediately went to war. Young men crossed into Zambia and Tanzania, got trained by Soviets and Chinese, and came back with AK-47s. For the first few years, the Rhodesian security forces crushed them. Better training, better equipment, helicopters, air support. The kill ratios were absurd, sometimes 50-1 in favor of Rhodesia. White Rhodesians looked at these numbers and convinced themselves they were winning. But guerrilla warfare doesn't work on kill ratios. It works on time, and Rhodesia was bleeding. By 1978, white men were spending 6 months of every year on military duty. The economy was hemorrhaging from defense spending, over 40% of the budget. Immigration was accelerating. Families packed up for South Africa, Australia, anywhere that wasn't a war zone. And then the Portuguese government collapsed in 1974, and Mozambique became independent under a Marxist government that gave the guerrillas an entire new border to operate from. The war intensified. Farm attacks became routine. Landmines on rural roads, funerals every week. The white population started to realize what military analysts already knew. They couldn't win. Not because they weren't brave or skilled, because the math simply didn't work. You can't have 270,000 people hold down 5 million forever, no matter how good your tactics are. In 1979, everyone sat down in London and negotiated. Smith signed away everything he had fought for. Elections were held in February 1980. Robert Mugabe won. And on April 18, 1980, Rhodesia ceased to exist. How did it get this bad, and how so fast? Modern Rhodesia's story starts with one of history's great scams. In 1888, a businessman named Cecil Rhodes sent representatives to meet King Lobengula of the Ndebele. They presented him with a document called the Rudd Concession. It was written in English. Lobengula couldn't read English. His translators told him he was granting mining rights to a small area. The document actually gave Rhodes exclusive rights to all the minerals in the entire kingdom. When Lobengula figured this out and sent envoys to London to protest, the British government ignored them. This wasn't incompetence, this was the plan. Rhodes had a royal charter from Britain allowing his company to colonize territory. He wanted gold, he wanted land, and he had guns. In 1893, war broke out. The Battle of Shangani showed what happened when Maxim guns that fired 600 rounds per minute met spears and shields. About 700 company soldiers defeated Mbele's army, estimated in the several thousands. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. 3 years later, both the Ndebele and Shona people rose up in the First Chimurenga. They attacked settlements, they cut supply lines for months. The outcome was genuinely uncertain. But more troops arrived, more machine guns, more artillery. Technology won. Thousands died. By 1898, it was over. The territory was officially named Southern Rhodesia. What followed was systematic dispossession. White settlers arrived and were given land, not empty land where Africans had been living for generations. The indigenous population was pushed onto reserves, areas too small and poor to support them. The Land Apportionment Act of 1930 made it official. About 49 million acres reserved for whites, who numbered around 50,000, over 1 million Africans confined to what remained. It wasn't even a fair split. Whites got the best agricultural land, the areas near rail lines and cities, the regions with reliable rainfall, and Africans got the scraps. The laws went further. Past laws controlled where Africans could travel. The Industrial Conciliation Act excluded them from skilled jobs, separate schools, separate facilities, separate lives. The entire system was designed to keep wealth and power in the whites' hands. From the white perspective, it worked. Salisbury grew up into a beautiful city with wide streets and jacaranda trees. Farms produced tobacco and maize for export. The economy grew, and most white Rhodesians believed that they were bringing civilization to Africa. They saw themselves as builders, developers, pioneers. They had fought drought and disease. They'd created infrastructure where none existed. They paid African workers more than some independent African countries paid theirs. What they didn't see or chose not to see was the foundation it all rested on. Forced labor, laws that treated the majority of the population as a second-class residents in their own country. That foundation was about to crack. In 1960, something happened that terrified white Rhodesians. 17 African countries gained independence in a single year. Ghana had gone first in 1957, then the floodgates opened. Nigeria, the Belgian Congo, Somalia, Senegal, Mali, Madagascar. The British Empire was dissolving. France was leaving Algeria. The Portuguese colonies were erupting in rebellion. The entire colonial order was collapsing. Harold Macmillan gave a speech in Cape Town in February 1960 about a wind of change blowing through Africa. He told white South Africans that Britain would grant independence to its African colonies with majority rule. The speech shocked white settler communities who had assumed Britain would support them forever. White Rhodesians watched Kenya, where the Mau Mau Rebellion had targeted white settlers. They watched the Congo, where independence led immediately to chaos, army mutinies, Belgian civilians attacked, the prime minister murdered, civil war. They watched Algeria, where nearly 1 million Europeans fled after independence. These white Rhodesian thinking. Not Tanzania's beautiful transition, not Kenya's negotiated settlement where many whites stayed. The worst cases, the catastrophes. And they convinced themselves those catastrophes were inevitable. That majority rule meant they would lose everything. Their farms confiscated, their businesses destroyed, themselves driven out or killed. This wasn't just propaganda. Most white Rhodesians genuinely believed this. The arithmetic was unavoidable. 270,000 to 5 million. In a democracy, whites would have zero power, and they were convinced that meant zero safety. The man who came to embody this position was Ian Smith. Born in Rhodesia in 1919, he flew Spitfires in World War II, got shot down over Italy, and spent months evading capture. He was a genuine war hero. He fought for Britain against fascism, and now that same Britain was telling him to accept majority rule? To Smith and most white Rhodesians, that felt like betrayal. They had been loyal. They had fought for the empire, and now the empire was siding with the African nationalists against them. Smith became prime minister in 1964 on a platform of no compromise. Britain tried to negotiate. They established 5 principles for independence, including progress towards majority rule, and proposals that were acceptable to the people as Rhodesia as a whole. Smith rejected everything. He proposed franchise systems so complex that almost no Africans could vote, reserved seats that would guarantee white control forever, constitutional provisions that gave whites a permanent veto. Britain said no. Not because they were socialist or anti-white, because the entire point of decolonization was that the colonies should become independent under governments chosen by the majority. The negotiations went nowhere. Prime Minister Harold Wilson met with Smith on the HMS Tiger in 1966 and HMS Fearless in 1968. Each time, discussions seemed productive. Each time, Smith returned to Rhodesia and rejected everything. Wilson genuinely believed he could solve this through diplomacy. He was wrong. Smith wasn't negotiating in good faith. He was just buying time. On November 11th, 1965, Smith went on TV and declared independence. Rhodesia was severing ties with Britain, a rebellion, a unilateral declaration of independence. White Rhodesians celebrated. Church bells rang in Salisbury. This was their finest hour. They had taken control of their destiny. What they had actually done was start a war. The international reaction was immediate. The UN condemned UDI within days. Britain declared that Smith's government was illegal. Comprehensive sanctions followed: oil embargoes, trade bans, financial restrictions. Harold Wilson confidently predicted the rebellion would collapse within weeks, not months. He was spectacularly wrong, because Rhodesia had a lifeline that made sanctions near meaningless: South Africa. South Africa in 1965 was under apartheid, its own white minority rule system. The South African government had zero interest in seeing Rhodesia fall. If Rhodesia collapsed, they'd be next. More importantly, geography made sanctions unenforceable. Rhodesia was landlocked. Its only routes to the sea were through South Africa or Portuguese Mozambique. Both kept their borders open. Oil was the critical test. Rhodesia had no domestic production. Without fuel, the economy would die immediately. But the oil kept flowing. It arrived in South African ports, got loaded onto trucks, and then crossed into Rhodesia. The route was open and obvious. Britain couldn't stop it without invading South Africa. Chrome was another sanctions-busting success. Rhodesia had massive chrome deposits. The United States needed chrome for steel and military applications. Despite sanctions, American companies kept buying through intermediaries. The Byrd Amendment in 1971 actually legalized importing Rhodesian chrome, directly violating UN sanctions. Tobacco was Rhodesia's major export. It should have been destroyed by sanctions. Instead, it got relabeled as South African or Mozambican and sold internationally. Buyers knew what they were getting. The paperwork gave them deniability. The result was that sanctions hurt, but were not decisive. The GDP dropped about 15 to 20% initially, but then it stabilized. The economy adapted, manufacturing expanded to replace imports, and white Rhodesians made do with less variety and lower quality. And perseveringly, sanctions strengthened Smith's government. Every hardship became proof of righteousness. The world was against them, which meant they must be right. The siege mentality deepened. Britain never used military force. Sending British soldiers to fight people who considered themselves British, who had fought for Britain in 2 world wars, created impossible optics. So Britain imposed sanctions and hoped the problem would resolve itself. It wouldn't. Because while sanctions squeezed the economy, something more dangerous was happening. African nationalist movements were preparing for war, and unlike sanctions, war would actually work. The first guerrilla attacks came in the mid-1960s. Small groups from Zambia, brief firefights, then retreating. The Rhodesian government called them terrorists. They dismissed them as communist agitators, but they were wrong. This was the beginning of a war that would last 15 years and destroy Rhodesia. ZAPU operated from Zambia, drawing support from the Ndebele people. ZANU operated from Tanzania and later Mozambique, with its base among the Shona majority. The Soviet Union and China provided weapons and training as well. Initially, the Rhodesian security forces won easily. Better trained, better equipped, with helicopters, the kill ratios were absurdly in Rhodesia's favor. White Rhodesians looked at these numbers and thought they were winning. They didn't understand the warfare. The guerrillas operated in rural areas, supplied by villagers who supported them, or feared them, or both. They held political meetings explaining why they were fighting. They promised land and equality. They recruited constantly, replacing losses faster than Rhodesia could inflict them. The Rhodesian government responded with the Protected Villages program, forcibly relocating hundreds of thousands of Africans into fortified compounds surrounded by barbed wire. The official reason was protection. The real reason was cutting off guerrilla supplies. It didn't work. The guerrillas adapted, and the policy created enormous resentment that drove more people to support the liberation movements. For white Rhodesians, military service became everything. Every white male was conscripted, initially for 9 months, then 18, eventually 2 years, and after service they remained in reserves, subject to call-ups that grew longer and more frequent. By the 1970s, some men spent 6 months of every year on duty. Farms suffered, businesses struggled, and families were disrupted. But most accepted it because they believed they were defending their home. The Rhodesian forces developed tactics that became legendary. The Selous Scouts infiltrated guerrilla groups. The SAS conducted deep raids. The Rhodesian Light Infantry pioneered helicopter tactics. These units were effective. They consistently won engagements, but they were winning battles while losing the war. Every guerrilla killed created more recruits. Every village punished pushed more towards the liberation movements. A military coup, and then in April 1974, everything changed. A military coup in Portugal overthrew the government. The new regime immediately ended Portugal's colonial wars. Mozambique gained independence in 1975 under Frelimo, a Marxist movement. For Rhodesia, it was catastrophic. The entire eastern border was now controlled by a government that supported the guerrillas. ZANU's military wing could operate freely in Mozambique. Training camps proliferated. Infiltration routes multiplied. The war intensified dramatically. By 1972, about 100 security force members died. By 1978, it was over 400. Thousands of guerrillas were being killed annually, but their numbers kept growing. ZANU recruits over 10,000 fighters in 1977 alone. White immigration accelerated. The population, which had peaked around 270,000 in 1975, began declining. Brain drain and capital flight weakened the economy. Defense spending consumed over 40% of the budget. The psychological toll was immense. Funerals became routine, farmers slept with weapons, the siege mentality deepened, but cracks were appearing. And critically, South Africa was reconsidering its support. Facing its own pressures, South Africa decided supporting Rhodesia was too costly. They told Smith to find a political solution. The message was clear: you're on your own. In September 1976, Smith shocked white Rhodesia by announcing he would accept majority rule in principle. The man who said never in 1,000 years was now saying it was inevitable. But he wanted majority rule in name only. By 1978, he installed Bishop Abel Muzorewa as prime minister in what was renamed Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. Elections were held that excluded the main liberation movements. It was majority rule as window dressing. Nobody was fooled. The guerrilla war continued. The international community refused recognition. Sanctions remained. By 1979, everyone was exhausted. The guerrillas had been fighting for 15 years, the Rhodesian forces were overstretched, and the economy was in ruins. And finally, genuine pressure arrived. Margaret Thatcher became British Prime Minister in May 1979. And despite her conservative politics and sympathy for white Rhodesians, she recognized that the war had to end. African leaders at a Commonwealth conference made clear that resolving Rhodesia was a prerequisite for cooperation with Britain. Thatcher's government, working with the Americans, applied real pressure for the first time. The Lancaster House Conference convened in London in September 1979. Smith, Mugabe, Nkomo, and Muzorewa all attended. For 3 months, they argued over every detail. Mugabe was reluctant to compromise. He believed ZANU was winning militarily. Why settle when victory seemed possible? But pressures mounted. The frontline states wanted peace. Even Mozambique's Samora Machel, ZANU's key ally, pushed Mugabe to accept. His country was devastated by supporting the liberation struggle. On December 21, 1979, all parties signed the Lancaster House Agreement. Rhodesia would become independent as Zimbabwe under majority rule. Free elections under British supervision, a new constitution, white Rhodesians would get reserved parliamentary seats for 7 years, and guarantees that land reform would be gradual and compensated. Smith signed with visible reluctance. His life's work was ending. Elections were held in February 1980, and ZANU won decisively, 57 out of the 100 seats. Robert Mugabe, the man white Rhodesians had been told was a communist terrorist who would slaughter them, had won through the ballot box. White Rhodesians panicked. Many had already left, and others packed their bags. Property values collapsed. The fear was palpable. And then Mugabe gave his victory speech. On March 4, 1980, Robert Mugabe addressed the nation. White Rhodesians watched and waited for threats, for promises of revenge, for confirmation of their worst fears. Instead, Mugabe called for reconciliation. He said Zimbabwe would be built on cooperation between all races. He promised whites who stayed that they would be welcome as equal citizens. He spoke of healing the wounds of war. He specifically addressed white fears. No mass nationalization, no confiscations, no persecution. The speech stunned white Rhodesians. Within days, Mugabe followed through. He appointed whites to his cabinet, including keeping the Rhodesian military commander. He met with white business leaders and promised property rights would be protected. On April 18, 1980 at midnight, Rhodesia ceased to exist. The flag came down, the new flag of Zimbabwe was raised, Prince Charles attended, and Bob Marley performed. For black Zimbabweans, it was jubilation. After 90 years of colonial rule, after 15 years of war, they had won their freedom. For white Rhodesians, it was the end of their world, but not in the way they feared. There were no massacres, no mass explosions, no immediate confiscations. Many whites left anyway, but tens of thousands stayed. They discovered they could live in Zimbabwe as Zimbabwean citizens. They could keep their farms and businesses. They could participate in society on equal terms rather than as a privileged minority. The early years offered genuine hope. Mugabe pursued conciliation. The economy actually grew initially. Education expanded dramatically. School enrollment for black children soared from around 60% to well over 90% just in a few years. Healthcare improved and infrastructure investment increased. White commercial farmers who stayed found that they could prosper. Zimbabwe had become the breadbasket of South Africa, exporting food to neighbors. The predicted immediate economic collapse never happened. For nearly a decade, Zimbabwe seemed to be succeeding. It wasn't perfect. In the early 1980s, Mugabe's government conducted a brutal campaign in Matabeleland that killed thousands. But compared to the worst predictions, Zimbabwe was functioning. Then things went wrong. The full story involves economic mismanagement, corruption, drought, and ultimately catastrophic land reform in the thousands. When white-owned farms were violently seized, agricultural production collapsed. The economy entered a death spiral. By 2010, Zimbabwe had become synonymous with failed states. Mugabe, who started with conciliation, ended as authoritarian clinging to power through intimidation. He wasn't removed until 2017, after 37 years. This decline is often cited as proof that white Rhodesians were right all along. The majority rule inevitably led to a disaster, that Rhodesia was better. But this argument requires examining more carefully. Let's look at what actually happened economically, because this is where mythology and reality diverge most. Rhodesia under white rule did see growth, but heavily skewed to whites. In 1979, GDP per capita was around $800. The economy had contracted during the war, but the bigger question is, who benefited? The white majority had European living standards. The black majority lived in poverty. Average African wages were deliberately kept low, access to education was restricted, and healthcare was segregated and unequal. Prosperity was concentrated almost entirely in white hands. After independence, the real improvement was for the black majority. Primary school enrollment soared. Through the 1980s, GDP per capita actually rose modestly, reaching roughly 1,000 to 1,100 before later crisis. The crisis came later, especially after 2000 with fast-track land reform. Attributing this to majority rule rather than specific policy choices is a logical error. Compare Zimbabwe to Botswana, which gained independence in 1966 under majority rule. Similar colonial history, similar demographics, but today Botswana is one of Africa's success stories. Steady growth, functioning democracy, and good government. The difference isn't majority rule, it's how rule was exercised. War statistics also matter. So here's the truth about Rhodesia that nobody wants to hear. The Rhodesian aesthetic celebrates military prowess, frontier independence, a romantic last stand narrative. These are emotionally appealing, but they exist in a specific political context. Rhodesia became a symbol in contemporary debates about race and democracy and power. It represents a time when white minority rule was open and unapologetic, when racial hierarchy was enforced by law, and when military force maintained the system against majority aspirations. The truth about Rhodesia is this: it was a country that existed for 15 years as an independent state. Their story deserves to be told completely, honestly, and with all the uncomfortable details that don't neatly fit into anyone's narrative.